Good morning. Welcome by Steps 100 with Michiel Bartels, Ernst Hofma, and me, Hugo Schippers. Today we're going to talk about neuroticism and self-compassion. That's what we're going to look at. And our research question today is, to what extent is there a significant relationship between neuroticism and self-compassion? In research question number 1, this is the independent variable and this is the dependent variable. Let's have a look at previous research. Welcome to Steps 100, and we're going to talk about previous research. Fattheischer and Geiger in 2017 looks at neuroticism and self-compassion, and they found correlation. In fact, their theory is that when in self-compassion the negative factor is lacking, meaning that when you do something wrong and something bad happens, you say, okay, well, it could have happened to anyone. And this is replaced by neuroticism. Interestingly enough, back in 2006, Nav, Root, and Kirkpatrick looked at this, and they said, well, we've also done a self-compassion scale. We've used different scales, different techniques, and it's very hard to say if it's neuroticism that causes self-compassion, a lack of self-compassion, or a lack of self-compassion that causes neuroticism. Neurotic individuals might be more prone to be affected by a negative mindset caused by self-compassion, and people that initially have a lack of self-compassion might develop neurotic tendencies. So our hypothesis is that there is in fact a significant correlation between the two. However, we cannot set a causal link, probably also not in our research.
On to the methods section of our study. So because we wanted to find out the relationship between two different variables, we used a correlational research design. For this research design, we had a sample of social science students taking part in an Intro to Methods and Statistics course. This is an obvious case of convenience sampling. There were 103 participants. However, not all of these participants participated in both the questionnaires. There were 76 participants who took the neuroticism questionnaire and 77 who took the self-compassion questionnaire. And in the end, there were 51 participants who responded to both questionnaires, and thus we could only use these 51 to make the comparison between the two questionnaires and find out the relationship. In order to define how neurotic a person is, we used the Big 5 personality test, which also tests for different personality traits, but also has a number of questions on neuroticism specifically, and we only used these questions. For self-compassion, we used the self-compassion scale developed by Neff, and both of these tests actually consist of a number of statements which can be answered on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 standing for disagree or never, and 5 standing for agree or always. All questions were phrased in such a way that answering 5 would mean having a high score on neuroticism or being very self-compassionate. If they were not phrased this way, they were recoded in SPSS. In order to analyze our data, we used SPSS. There were two kinds of tests that we applied to our data. First of all, correlational test, Pearson correlation test to be precise, and then the other one, a regression analysis. For all our tests, we used the significance level of 0.05, and the missing data were deleted and omitted, meaning that all respondents who did not respond to both questionnaires had missing data and were thus not taken into account for the final results of the experiment.
Let's define the concept we're working with. For conceptual definitions for neuroticism, we found neuroticism to be equal to the overall degree of emotional stability in an individual. For self-compassion, the conceptual definition is the extending of compassion to one's self in case of inadequacy, failure, or general suffering. We measured those conceptual definitions by taking the total scores of the Socrative questionnaires found in workspaces provided to us. Let's head to the results of our research. Results. First, we did a Pearson correlation test. Here are the results. What we can see from the correlation test is that there was a very weak correlation found. The correlation coefficient is minus 0.105. This means that the relation is indeed negative as we expected, however very small. Unfortunately, the significance of this is 0.465. This is two-tailed, but even if it was one-tailed, this is too high to be significant. We then went on with a regression analysis. This scatter plot shows you that there's indeed no correlation. As you can see, those points, although hardly differing in neuroticism set out on the x-axis, hugely differ in self-compassion. And I can point out a lot of those point pairs that hardly differ in neuroticism and highly differ in self-compassion. From the scatter plot, it becomes clear to us why we can't find a significant correlation between those two variables. We continued by performing a regression analysis. But as stated before, there's unfortunately no significant correlation found between our variables. This means that although a constant and a slope for a regression line was found, we're still faced with the problem of having a non-significant relationship. This means we can't predict self-compassion from our neuroticism scores. Results. Is there a correlation found between the two variables? No. Unfortunately, the correlation tests were rendered insignificant results. We can't conclude a correlation between the two variables on the basis of our correlation test. Can we predict self-compassion from the neuroticism scores? No. As results are still insignificant, we can't do anything with them. Did our hypothesis of a negative correlation between neuroticism and self-compassion turn out to be correct according to our results? No. Our hypothesis, unfortunately, is falsified.
Welcome at Stats 100, and let's talk about conclusions. We didn't find a significant relation between neuroticism or self-correlation, not in both directions, in any directions. So what we have to do is to talk about the limitations. These confound variables might explain why we didn't find a significant relation. One of them is we didn't have a random sample. In fact, it was a convenient sample. We got who we were able to get through the classes, through the statistics classes. Everybody did the sign up. Another one, this is actually mentioned by Kirkpatrick, is that we only use the questionnaire. And a questionnaire is not good enough to fully grasp both concepts. So not only does this mean external validity is affected, but also combined with the fact that we didn't have a random sample, internal validity is affected. So for future research, what do we need to do? Get a random sample, get a bigger sample, and change the ways in which we test. Also important, why don't we have a control group? We should have a control group and randomly assign people to that. Alright, thank you for listening. This was Stats 100. Merry Christmas.